You know, when an earthquake hits, the devastation isn't always right there at the epicenter.
Right, yeah.
Like sometimes a fault line slips miles away, deep under the ocean, and the real damage happens when that massive energy travels across the water,
Mm.
completely unseen, until it just, crashes right into the foundation of your own house.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, so welcome to today's deep dive, and a special welcome to you, the learner. Because as we sit here today, it's March 14th, 2026, and we are feeling the tremors of a massive global seismic event.
But we definitely aren't talking about tectonic plates today.
No, we are not. We are talking about geopolitics and really how a distant conflict is cracking the economic foundation right under our feet.
Yeah. And we've got a really compelling stack of sources to go through today to help make sense of it all.
We really do. We're looking at this comprehensive analysis. It's called Oil Shocks and the American Class Squeeze. And we're pairing that with fresh, up-to-the-minute data from Reuters, the Associated Press, the International Energy Agency, and Barclays.
Right. Which gives us a pretty wide lens on this.
Exactly. But really quickly, because our sources do touch on politically charged global conflicts and domestic policy, we want to be super clear up front. We aren't taking sides or endorsing any political viewpoints today.
Yeah, absolutely not. That's not what we do here.
Right. Our job is simply to impartially unpack the facts and the arguments presented in this source material so you can understand the actual mechanics of what's happening.
Just sticking to the data and the analysis.
Exactly. The mission here is to understand why the most critical fallout from the current crisis in the Middle East isn't just playing out on the battlefield. It is playing out in the grocery aisles, at the gas pumps, and in the job markets right here at home.
Yeah, it's hitting everyone's wallets.
It really is. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to understand the domestic economic pain we're seeing right now, we really have to start at the source of the shockwave.
Right, the trigger.
Yeah, the trigger. So the current U.S.-Israel war with Iran has practically paralyzed the Strait of Hormuz.
And just for context, for anyone who might not be looking at a map right now, the Strait of Hormuz is this tiny, narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
Right. It's small, but it is arguably the single most critical choke point for the entire global oil trade.
It's massive for trade.
Oh, totally. When traffic through that strait stops or, even just slows down significantly, global energy markets basically go into immediate cardiac arrest.
Which totally explains the scale of the emergency response we're seeing. I mean, the Reuters and AP reporting proves there is serious panic happening.
Yeah, the numbers are wild.
They are. The U.S. just released 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Right.
And then on top of that, the International Energy Agency is coordinating this record 400 million barrel release globally.
Which is just, it's an unprecedented deployment of emergency assets.
Yeah, 500 million barrels.
Exactly. When global agencies are coordinating to flood the market with nearly 500 million barrels of backup oil, you are looking at a system in absolute distress.
They're just trying to forcefully suppress the price spike.
Right, but the market reaction tells us the intervention is really struggling to keep up. Brent crude instantly pushed above $100 a barrel.
And for anyone unfamiliar, Brent crude is basically the global benchmark. Right?
Yeah, it's essentially the price tag the world looks at to decide what a barrel of oil is worth on any given day.
Right. And back in the U.S., we felt that immediately. Gas prices spiked 21%, hitting about $3.63 a gallon practically overnight.
It was incredibly fast.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the conflict is aggressively spreading regionally.
Yeah, the sources mention Iran is threatening infrastructure in the Gulf states.
Right, and the UAE is issuing warnings for residents to just stay away from ports entirely.
And Hezbollah is fighting in Lebanon. It's a mess. When I look at the 400 million barrel oil release, it kind of feels like putting a bucket under a busted water main.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right, like it catches the water and buys you a little time so your basement doesn't flood instantly, but it doesn't actually fix the broken pipe.
No, it doesn't fix the pipe at all.
But I do have to wonder about the long-term scale of this threat because, groups like Hamas and the Houthis are currently, quote-unquote, calibrating their response, right? They aren't launching an all-out full-force offensive.
Right.
So doesn't that mean the worst of this is basically contained?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the real danger to the global economy isn't necessarily a sudden, massive battlefield escalation.
Wait, really? What is it then?
The core threat is the persistent, lingering possibility of a broader regional war.
Just the threat of it.
Exactly. That mere possibility keeps energy markets inherently unstable energy traders and insurance companies, they don't just price in what is happening
Going to
today.
price in tomorrow.
Right. They price in what could happen tomorrow. So even if the front lines don't move dramatically, the daily threat that the Strait of Hormuz could be completely blockaded, well, that bakes a massive risk premium into every single barrel of oil.
Okay, so meaning we are basically paying a premium just for the anxiety of the market.
Yeah, a calibrated response simply stretches that anxiety out over time.
Yeah.
It ensures this prolonged, agonizing period of instability that just slowly drains the economic system rather than, a short, sharp shock that resolves quickly.
So the uncertainty itself is the tax.
Perfectly said.
But, a global energy shock is really only half of the equation here.
Right.
The other half is the condition of the country that is getting hit by the shock wave.
Uh-huh.
We have to look at the fragile state of the U.S. economy exactly when this crisis arrived.
Yeah, the timing is critical.
According to the analysis in our sources, the U.S. economy already had these deep stress fractures before this war even escalated. Growth had already slowed down, and inflation was still stubbornly sitting above the Federal Reserve's target.
We really entered this crisis from a position of vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because if an economy is booming and inflation is low, it can actually absorb a temporary energy shock pretty well.
Sure, it has a buffer.
Right. But when the foundation is already cracking, the shock wave does exponential damage.
And you can see those cracks really clearly in the labor market. Reuters and AP report that February job losses hit 92,000.
Which is a huge hit.
Yeah, and that pushed the national unemployment rate up to 4.4%.
Yeah.
At the exact same time, we're seeing this massive shrinkage in the public sector.
The numbers there are startling.
They really are. The federal civilian workforce shrank by 12% between September 2024 and January 2026.
Yeah.
But let me just push back on the panic around that 4.4% unemployment number for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
If we look at a historical chart, 4.4% is still, honestly, incredibly low. I mean, during the 2008 financial crisis, it hit 10%. During the pandemic, it was even higher. So are we overreacting to the job market data just because we've gotten so used to historically low unemployment?
Well, looking purely at the headline percentage really masks the underlying mechanics of how the labor market is actually functioning right now.
Okay, how so?
The sources describe our current environment as a low-hire, low-fire dynamic.
Low hire, low fire.
Exactly. Mass layoffs are relatively contained. Companies aren't firing tens of thousands of people every week, mostly because they remember how incredibly hard it was to hire people over the last few years.
Oh, so they're hoarding workers.
Yes, they are hoarding the labor they currently have.
Mm.
But as a result of that, hiring has just completely frozen.
Ah, so it's a trap. If you are already inside a company, you're relatively safe.
Yeah, mostly.
But the moment you lose your job, or I guess if you're a recent graduate trying to enter the workforce, the door is locked tight.
And that is the absolute peril of the low-hire, low-fire trap. It is getting exponentially harder to find reemployment.
Wow.
So you have this brutal collision of two forces: skyrocketing energy costs hitting your wallet on one side,
Yeah.
and your ability to replace lost income at its absolute weakest on the other side.
That's a bad combination.
It is. That specific combination is what makes a 4.4% unemployment rate in 2026 feel much, much more dangerous than a 4.4% rate in a booming economy.
Right. Which smoothly moves us from the global trigger to the domestic fragility to the actual impact on everyday people.
Right, where it actually hits home.
Because a 21% spike in gas prices does not hit everyone the same way. The oil shocks and the American class squeeze analysis details how a war abroad mutates into this vicious class issue at home.
Yeah, creating what economists call a K-shaped economy.
K-shaped economy.
Yeah, so the K-shape is essentially a visual representation of divergence.
Okay.
The upper arm of the K angles upward, representing wealthy households. They might notice higher prices, sure, but they have the disposable income and the assets to comfortably absorb pricier gas and groceries without really changing their lifestyle.
Right, they complain about it, but they're fine.
Exactly. But the lower arm of the K angles downward, representing poor and middle-class households who simply do not have the margin to absorb those costs.
They just don't have the buffer.
No, they are forced into a downward trajectory.
And it isn't just the price at the pump either. Fuel prices have this brutal ripple effect across literally everything we consume.
Oh, it touches everything.
Yeah, like diesel fuel powers the trucking industry, and the trucking industry handles almost all food distribution.
Right.
Energy costs dictate electricity bills, delivery fees, and even the manufacturing of basic household goods. And this creates what the analysis calls real inflation.
Real inflation, yeah.
Because if you are a working class family spending a huge percentage of your income on basic essentials like food, power, transportation, you are experiencing a level of inflation that is drastically more intense than the headline inflation number reported on the evening news.
Because headline inflation looks at an average basket of goods across the entire economy.
Right. It includes TVs and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you can't budget your way out of buying groceries or, paying the utility bill to keep your lights on. Those are non-negotiable expenses.
You have to pay them.
Yeah. When the prices of non-negotiables spike, real inflation for that lower arm of the K-shape just goes through the roof.
And the analysis actually breaks down exactly how this squeeze hits different classes. It starts with the poor, who get hit in 3 distinct ways.
Right ways, right.
The first wave is immediate. Gas, food, and utilities just jump in price.
Boom, right away.
Right. And then the second wave comes from the public sector. Now, we mentioned earlier that the federal civilian workforce shrank by 12% in just over a year.
Yeah.
How does a reduction in federal employees directly impact a low-income family's daily survival? Like, what's the connection there?
It's a great question. Because when we talk about the federal civilian workforce, it is really easy to just picture politicians in Washington.
Right. Suits in D.C.
Exactly. But this workforce actually includes the people administering federal block grants to local communities. It includes the staff processing housing assistance, managing federal funding for local clinics, and overseeing food programs.
Oh, so the actual administrative pipeline.
Yes. When that workforce shrinks by 12% so rapidly, the administrative pipes that deliver funding to local safety nets basically get clogged, or they just shut down entirely.
Wow.
So the money and the resources stop flowing to the community level right when vulnerable families need them the most.
So the safety net physically shrinks just as the economic floor is falling out from underneath them.
Exactly.
And then comes the third wave, right? The labor market lockout we just discussed.
Right.
If a low-income worker gets let go because their employer is cutting costs to deal with high energy prices, they're thrown into that totally frozen job market.
And they can't get back in.
Right. And when they run out of cash, they turn to the only buffer they have left: credit cards. They become the ultimate shock absorbers for survival.
Which is terrifying, because relying on credit cards for basic survival is a massive systemic vulnerability.
Yeah.
When families are using credit cards with like 20% or 24% interest rates just to buy milk and eggs, they are borrowing against a future income they cannot guarantee.
They're digging a hole just to stand on flat ground.
That's exactly what it is.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The sources make a really clear distinction between how this hits the poor versus how it hits the middle class.
Yes, they do.
Because for the middle class, this isn't an overnight collapse. It's more of an erosion. Like, a middle class household might look perfectly fine on paper.
They still have their jobs.
Right. They have jobs. They are paying their mortgage. But they are steadily losing margin every single month.
Just getting squeezed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They are forced to delay buying a home. They stop putting money into their 401k. They cancel travel. Or, worse, they delay necessary medical care because the budget is just too tight. If you think about this economic shock like a problem with your car, for the poor, it's an immediate catastrophic blowout at 70 miles an hour on the highway.
Right, just devastating.
But for the middle class, this is like a slow, invisible leak in a tire. You can still drive on it for a while. You might not even notice it at first, but it ruins your gas mileage, the handling gets sluggish, and eventually the wheel itself is going to be completely destroyed.
And driving on that slow leak eventually causes the entire economic vehicle to veer off the road.
Yeah.
Think about it. The government uses the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as a buffer for the oil market.
Yeah.
But ordinary Americans don't have a strategic savings reserve.
No, they definitely don't.
So when middle-class families exhaust their credit limits just to cover basic inflation, consumer spending inevitably crashes.
And we all know what happens then.
Right. Since consumer spending drives the vast majority of the U.S. economy, that slow erosion eventually triggers a broader recession.
Which is grim.
Yeah.
And to understand where this current squeeze leads, the sources actually dive into how previous oil shocks mutated.
Yeah, the historical context is key here.
Because these events, they don't just stay confined to spreadsheets, right?
Right.
They become deep social and political fractures.
History is flashing bright red warning signs right now. The source material draws direct comparisons to the Arab oil embargo of 1973 and 1974,
Right.
the Iranian Revolution shock of 1978 and 1979, the Gulf crisis, and even the more recent post-Ukraine energy shock in 2022.
Yeah, we've seen this movie before.
We have. And the Federal Reserve's own history proves that oil shocks act as massive recession amplifiers, especially when inflation is already elevated.
The mechanism is just almost predictable at this point. Conflict disrupts the energy supply, the lack of supply lifts prices, those prices decimate household budgets, and then the central bank is forced to make impossible choices.
Impossible choices, right?
Barclays actually mapped out a few projections for our current crisis. They say if the Strait of Hormuz normalizes in 2 to 3 weeks, Brent crude probably drops back down to around $85 a barrel.
Which is painful, but it's a relatively short spike.
Right. But if the disruption lasts 4 to 6 weeks, oil stays near $100. And if the conflict drags on into a prolonged standoff, the sources warn we risk entering a classic stagflation scenario.
The dreaded stagflation.
Yeah, so break down stagflation for me. Why is it the absolute ultimate nightmare for central banks like the Federal Reserve?
Okay, so stagflation is the simultaneous collision of stagnant economic growth and high inflation.
So everything is bad at once.
Basically, yeah. And it is a nightmare because the traditional tools used by central banks totally contradict each other in this scenario.
What do you mean?
Well, normally, if inflation is too high, the Fed raises interest rates. This makes borrowing money more expensive, which cools down consumer spending and business expansion, and that eventually brings prices down.
But raising interest rates also slows down hiring and hurts economic growth, right?
Exactly. And conversely, if the economy is stagnant and people are losing jobs, the Fed usually lowers interest rates to make borrowing cheap, which stimulates businesses to hire and consumers to spend. But if you lower rates to stimulate the economy, you supercharge inflation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So in a stagflation scenario caused by an oil shock, the Fed is literally trapped. If they raise rates to fight the oil-driven inflation, they freeze an already weak job market and trigger a severe recession.
And if they cut rates?
If they cut rates to save jobs, the cost of living explodes even higher. They are trapped in a burning room, and their only tool is a bucket of gasoline.
That is a terrifying image. And the political repercussions of that trap are severe. The analysis points out that when this kind of unbearable pressure hits the lower and middle classes, political leaders inevitably deflect.
Always.
They point fingers at foreign enemies, immigrants, regulators, or, their domestic political opponents, rather than addressing the really uncomfortable structural truth.
Which is?
That the American economy basically operates without a financial buffer for ordinary people. So let me ask you this. Is the extreme political polarization and the toxic blame game we are seeing right now just a coincidence of the era we live in, or is it a direct symptom of the economic shock itself?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the polarization is absolutely a direct symptom.
You think so?
Without a doubt. Severe economic anxiety and political radicalization are historically baked into the aftermath of oil shocks.
Wow.
Think about it. When everyday people are stretched to their absolute breaking point, when they are working 50 hours a week, playing by the rules, and still having to put basic groceries on a high-interest credit card just to survive, anger skyrockets.
I mean, and that anger is entirely rational. The math of their lives is simply no longer working.
It is deeply rational.
Yeah.
But that anger has to go somewhere, right?
Yeah.
In periods of intense economic stress, a squeezed middle class and a devastated lower class become incredibly receptive to blame politics.
Because they need an answer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They are actively looking for the reason why they're drowning. The immediate facts of an oil shock are purely economic, but the downstream effects completely rewire the social and political fabric of a country.
So what does this all mean? Like when we synthesize all of this, the paralyzing of the Strait of Hormuz, the massive oil reserve releases, the low hire, low fire trap, the slow tire leak of the middle class, and this historical threat of stagflation, what is the ultimate takeaway from these sources?
It basically boils down to a pretty harsh reality about how global systems absorb damage.
Okay.
When a geopolitical shock hits, the wealthy have the capital and the assets to hedge their bets. Massive corporations have the pricing power to simply pass their increased costs right onto the consumer.
To protect themselves.
Right. And governments have emergency reserves and monetary tools to manage the macroeconomic panic. But the true burden of a global conflict is ultimately borne by the poor and the middle class. They are the ones who actually pay for the geopolitical crises of the world, at the gas pump, at the grocery store, and in a frozen labor market. The class squeeze isn't some accidental byproduct of an oil shock. It's the fundamental mechanism of how the shock is paid for.
Man, it is a really sobering realization. But it is exactly why you need to care about this deeply.
Absolutely.
Whether you are managing your own personal finances, running a small business, and analyzing your supply chain costs, or, just trying to navigate this K-shaped economy without losing your footing, understanding these mechanics is vital.
Yeah, it's essential.
Keeping an eye on the geopolitical tensions in a waterway thousands of miles away is just as important right now as watching the stock market. Because the stock market tells you how the wealthy are doing. The gas pump tells you how the country is doing.
You really cannot separate domestic affordability from global stability. The line between a distant conflict and your local grocery bill is direct and immediate.
And that brings us to the end of our dive today. But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Something to chew on.
Yeah, something to explore on your own that wasn't explicitly in today's sources, but it builds right on top of this entire conversation.
What is it?
We've spent all this time dissecting how a disruption in oil can instantly trigger a vicious class squeeze back home. But as the world slowly transitions toward renewable energy and electric vehicles in a desperate attempt to escape the grip of oil, what will be the next critical global commodity?
Oh, that's a great question.
Right. Will it be lithium for our massive battery grids? Will it be microchips for our entire digital infrastructure? What is the next choke point that has the power to send a shockwave across the ocean and crack the foundation of our economy all over again?
Because the underlying commodity driving the global economy might change, but the vulnerability of the middle and lower classes remains exactly the same.
The epicenter shifts, but the shockwave still finds its way to your front door. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking at the underlying mechanics of the economy, and we'll be right here to help you unpack whatever comes next.